The night was heavy with silence, except for the faint hum of crickets outside. I sat quietly, staring at the cracks in the wall, my heart beating like a trapped bird in my chest. He stood before me, his eyes bloodshot with anger, his voice trembling not with guilt but with fury. Then, before I could even gather the strength to defend myself, his hand swung across my face with a force that left my ears ringing. It wasn't the first time, but it was the last straw. My cheek burned, my pride shattered, and as I fell back against the chair, I caught her smirk in the shadows, the woman he had betrayed me with, standing there as if she owned my place, my life, my marriage. She whispered something in his ear, and he only grew more hostile, pointing at me as though I was the intruder in my own home. "You will learn your place," he spat, his words laced with venom. But inside me, something snapped. Pain turned into steel, and humiliation ignited a fire I never thought I had. I didn't respond, not with words, not with tears. I sat still, memorizing every detail of their faces, every sneer, every insult. That night, I swore to myself that he would regret the day he laid his hands on me. The following days, I played the perfect victim, silent, obedient, almost invisible. He thought he had broken me, that my silence meant surrender. She flaunted around the house, touching things that didn't belong to her, poisoning his mind against me further. But while they mocked, I planned. Every insult became fuel. Every bruise became a map, leading me to my revenge. I started with patience. I knew his weaknesses, the way he trusted me to manage his finances, the way he believed I was too timid to stand against him. Slowly, quietly, I shifted things. Small sums missing, investments rerouted, all under his name, all without his notice. She thought she was winning his heart, but I was winning the war he didn't even know had begun. At night, I would lie awake, my face still sore, my heart still bleeding, but my mind sharper than a blade. I gathered evidence, his texts, his late-night calls, his careless promises to her. I documented everything, storing them where he would never think to look. The house that had once been a prison became my battlefield, and I was no longer the weak woman cowering in its corners. The first real crack came when I watched him lose his temper at her the same way he once did with me. She wasn't so smug then, not when his voice turned harsh and his hands tightened in anger. I saw in her eyes the same fear I once felt, and for a fleeting second, I almost pitied her. But pity had no place in my heart anymore, only justice. One night, as he returned home reeking of alcohol, I finally put my plan into motion. He stumbled into the house, slurring his words, and collapsed onto the sofa. His phone slipped from his hand, buzzing with yet another message from her. I picked it up, smiled coldly, and began the final stage of my revenge. When he woke up, everything he valued would be gone, and that was just the beginning. Do you want me to continue building the next wave of her revenge with even more twists, betrayal, and shocking reveals step by step? He woke with a groan, eyes squinting against the afternoon sun that had seeped through the curtains. For a crazy, blessed moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the panic returned, sharp and animal, as memory stitched itself back into place. The bottle, her face, the conversation that had gone too far. He reached blindly for his phone, and his hand closed on the cold glass of device that no longer felt private. Across the room, I watched him from the doorway, my cheek still tender where his fist had landed, but my face composed into a calm he hadn't bargained on seeing. "Where have you been?" he slurred, trying to sound authoritative, but the words trembled. He glanced at the small table where his wallet used to sit, and immediately something else tightened, a small, empty space like a missing tooth. Confusion flitted over his features before morphing into irritation. He lifted himself, knees cracking, and lurched toward the kitchen. I let him go. Let him find the half-empty bottles, the receipts I'd left conspicuously on the counter, the meaningless clutter that would make him think chaos, not strategy. He fumbled with his phone to call her, thumb hovering, the screen a tiny window into his other life. I had timed everything. A message scheduled to send, an email queued at his work, a call forwarded to a number he couldn't imagine would be involved. When his thumb swiped, a series of images popped up. A string of messages I had curated from the many nights he'd forgotten to delete, screenshots I'd stitched into a neat, damning narrative. They were on his screen, but they did not belong to him now. I had already copied, forwarded, uploaded. "What's that?" he demanded, voice rising as he saw the first of the messages morph into a public post. His face changed again, the red that had once colored his cheeks with drunken bravado drained into white. "No, no!" He made as if to snatch the phone, but I moved before he could, my hand steady, my fingers closing around the device with a confidence he'd never seen me display. "This is the end of your secrets," I said softly. I typed a single command and watched the world pivot. An email with attachments, receipts, voice messages, a video of him admitting things under the influence, slid into the inboxes of 3 people whose opinions had mattered more to him than mine: his partner at the firm, his bank manager, and the woman he called his sister. At the same time, a private message found its way to her contacts and hers to his. The threads I had woven started tugging. Small at first, then with a force that would snap the life he'd built. He lunged, anger boiling, but it was a different kind of fury now, panicked, exposed. He tried to grab the phone back, to delete, to salvage. His hand brushed mine, and for a second the old reflexes, the ones that kept me silent, rose like ghosts. I did not flinch. Instead, I pressed his own phone into his palm and let him watch as the last of his privacy dissolved in pixels. Outside, tires crunched on the drive. Someone was coming. His eyes darted to the window. "Who did you call?" he hissed, voice low because he feared the world would hear. I smiled the way a person smiles before closing a book, with a small, private victory in the corners of my mouth. "Everyone," I answered. He stumbled to the door, but it was too late for a show of strength. The first message to his employer had done exactly what I intended: a brief, polite note from concerned third party, me, played as a discreet whistleblower, detailing irregular transactions. The bank had already frozen a small but crucial account flagged for suspicious activity. An automated reply from his partner's assistant pinged his phone like a hammer. "Can you come by the office now? Urgent." He faltered. For all his bluster, the man who had struck my face had a brittle backbone. Money and reputation were his bones. Strip those away, and his chest, one so broad and certain, caved inward. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the calculations in his eyes, how much to threaten, how much to bargain. He had always believed that fear and force were enough to buy surrender. He had never calculated for intelligence. "You're doing this because of her," he said finally, voice low and sharp. He wanted to pin motive to a single, simple thing: the Mistress, because if he could make the story about her, he could distract from the years of his own willful cruelty. "You want her. You're jealous." I laughed, a small, brittle sound. "Jealous?" I repeated. "No. I want what you said you had: respect, honesty, and the truth that I was owed. I want to show you that when you take a life for granted, it can break you." He stepped forward, but a car horn outside cut him off. Someone, my careful, anonymous friend at the restaurant where he'd met her, arrived right on cue. The doorbell rang like a punctuation mark in the thick silence that followed. He moved toward the door, and I watched, knowing that everything beyond it would change everything inside. I had arranged for 3 people to arrive in the next hour: the bank investigator, a courier with documents, and the woman who was a sister in name only, the one who could pull him away from his denials and force him to face his records. The courier knocked, then stood back as the bank investigator stepped in, suit pressed an expression too neutral to be reassuring. He carried a slim folder and, without preamble, laid it on the table between us like evidence in a court. "Mr. Kadeem," he said, using the name that sounded so official compared to the pet names he'd toyed with, "we flagged some irregular transfers from your account. We need to review them." Panic played across his face like lightning. He opened his mouth, but the bank investigator's assistant had already produced a printed list: dates, amounts, beneficiaries with names that were unfamiliar but traceable. "We can trace and freeze funds if it's necessary," she added, voice practice bureaucratic. "But we typically need authorization. However, we've been notified of potential fraudulent activity through a confidential tip." I felt his gaze prick my skin the way a needle pricks flesh. He looked for me to show guilt, contrition, something tender. When he found only steel, his breathing hitched. In that moment, I realized how much of my former life had been built on the illusion that he could make the world bend to his will. He had been a man who knocked me down. Now he was a man watching his empire unravel stitch by stitch, and there was nothing he could sweep under a rug because the rug had been burned. Outside, a car door closed. Footsteps approached the porch. He turned, the outline of threat hard in his expression, and for the first time I saw a flicker of fear that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the inevitability of consequences. The woman at his side, the one who'd stood in our living room like she owned it, had been nowhere to be seen since morning. Perhaps he'd sent her away. Perhaps she'd been given a different role in the drama. It didn't matter. The real players were at our threshold now. I had orchestrated it so methodically that even the air felt choreographed, every beat measured. He stepped between the men and the door as if he could physically barricade himself from the world. "This is a mistake," he said, trying on bravado again. "Someone's playing games." The bank investigator did not smile. He slid the folder to one side and opened his phone. A few taps, and a message on his screen, my prearranged message, appeared on a monitor that sat in the living room like a third witness. It showed transfers to shell companies, phone records that intersected with late-night calls, and a ledger with initials that matched his. He swallowed. For a man who had constructed a facade of control, the falling away of a lie is an ugly, sobering thing. There was a knock, gentle but insistent. The courier had arrived with a stack of papers. Subpoenas I had managed to initiate through a quietly placed anonymous tip. Divorce petitions drafted by a lawyer who respected discretion. Even a small, formal notice indicating a temporary restraining order requested by someone who claimed to be in danger. I watched his shoulders sag under the weight of the documents, as if each page were a stone placed upon him. He made one last attempt to salvage the moment, to charm the men, to weave a story that absolved him. He opened his mouth to lie when the front door opened wider, and the silhouette in the doorway became visible. Tall, composed, and colder than the winter he'd once promised me. She stepped inside not as the giddy interloper he brought home that night, but as a woman who had been watching. Perhaps even as my ally, perhaps with her own agenda, and she held in her hand something that made every heartbeat in the room hitch. It was not what I expected, not a confession, not a weapon. It was a letter, folded neat, stamped with a seal that made even me glance twice. He laughed then, a short, hysterical sound, because he thought he could still deflect. "What is that?" he demanded, voice strained. She smiled, a small, precise thing. "Open it," she said. "Read it aloud." He hesitated. His fingers trembled as he slid the paper free. The ink looked official, the kind of calligraphy used for wills and contracts. He unfolded it slowly, as if unwrapping a present that might contain repentance. He scanned the first line, then the second. Color drained from his face. The room, our living room, that had witnessed too many of his nights of triumph and cruelty, felt suddenly foreign. He looked at me then, eyes wide and searching for the anchor he'd always used. My submission, but I did not give it. I had spent too many nights with my cheek healing and my resolve growing. I felt the culmination of months arranged into a quiet triumph, and yet, as the words on the paper started to form his mouth, he realized the paper was not merely about money or bank accounts. It was about legacy, about people who had been waiting in the wings to see what kind of man he would be when pressed. It named names. It revealed alliances. It was a small bomb wrapped in ornate stationery, and when he read the first sentence aloud, the air in the room snapped taut like a wire about to be severed. "I, Ahmed Kadim," he began, voice small, "do hereby..." He did not finish. The sound of his own name in that context, a declaration not of power but an end, struck him in a place deeper than any fist ever had. He looked up, eyes frantic, and then behind him, at the window, at the drive, at whatever else might arrive to witness his fall. I met his gaze steadily, and for once he had no script. The people who had once been silent were speaking now, and the city outside seemed poised to listen. Footsteps on the path grew louder still, and a silhouette I had not expected halted at the gate. The courier, the investigator, the woman with the sealed letter, they all turned as one to the source. He followed their gaze and saw what I had arranged to be the final act of my opening salvo, a sedan pulling up, the driver stepping out to deliver one more envelope. The man who opened the car door carried something small but heavy, and when he lifted it, the sun caught on the edge of a badge that made everyone in the room, especially him, look away for a heartbeat too long. He tried to stand, to somehow reassert the authority that had once made him untouchable, but the world had shifted on its axis. The badge bore words that meant irrevocable change, and as the officer crossed the threshold and spoke into his radio, my mouth curved into a smile that did not quite reach my eyes because I was not yet finished. There were more moves to make, more players to call into the theater I created. The violin-tight sense of anticipation hummed through my veins like electricity. "Mr. Kadim," the officer said, voice official clipped, "we have a warrant to—" The sentence dissolved as the front door opened again, and another shadow fell across the threshold. Someone whose presence would tilt the night's balance in a way neither of us could foresee. I stepped forward, feeling the room narrow to a single pinprick of focus, and then the newcomer spoke a name that made every head in the house turn, and his face crumple as if struck. And before he could answer, I realized that the next move belonged not to me alone, but to a history of secrets that had been waiting to breathe. The paper in his hand trembled. The phone in his pocket vibrated with a call he couldn't ignore, and at that precise second, the lights flickered and the world outside our windows, the one he'd thought he'd control, began to whisper the truth that would unspool everything. The officer looked at me, then at him, and asked, almost gently, "Do you—" The silence in the room grew so thick it felt like a storm about to break. Every eye was on him, every breath held hostage by the weight of truth pressing down like a mountain. He stood there, his hands trembling around the papers, the mistress frozen by the door, the officer waiting with patience carved from steel. For once, the man who had always commanded the room had no words, no power, no fist strong enough to bend the moment back in his favor. He looked at me, his eyes full of disbelief, as though he couldn't recognize the woman standing before him. I was no longer the wife who flinched, no longer the fragile shadow who accepted silence as survival. I was something else entirely, an architect of consequence, a storm disguised in calm, the mirror he could not bear to face. And then, as if fate itself had conspired with me, another figure stepped into the room. It was my brother, the one he had always underestimated, the one he dismissed as weak and useless. But my brother carried with him a document far more dangerous than any blow to the face. It was a testament of inheritance, land, assets, wealth, once belonging to my family. My husband had mocked me for coming from nothing, had forgotten that my bloodline carried roots deeper and richer than the shallow empire he flaunted. My brother laid the document on the table with a finality that made the air shiver. "You see," he said, his voice steady and cold, "this house you live in, this land you walk on, this very roof over your head, it was never yours. It was hers, and now it returns to her." The officer turned his eyes toward me, as if to confirm what was unfolding. I nodded. Yes, everything had been orchestrated so carefully, piece by piece, that even destiny seemed to applaud my patience. My husband's face contorted, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of truth he could not strike away. He reached for Mistress's hand as though she could anchor him, but she recoiled, her loyalty crumbling in the face of ruin. The same woman who had once smirked at my suffering now looked at him with disgust. She had tasted the venom he poured into me, and now she realized he was poison to her too. "You said she was nothing," she whispered bitterly. "But look at her now, look at you now." And with that, she slipped out, her heels clicking like nails sealing a coffin. The officer stepped forward, reading aloud the warrant, his tone unyielding. Fraud, embezzlement, domestic abuse. All the charges I had carefully compiled and delivered in silence now stood tall before him. His lips parted, searching for excuses, but none came. He dropped into a chair, his face pale, his once towering pride reduced to ash. I stood still, my heart steady, my voice calm. "You hit me hard in the face because of her," I said, letting each word cut to the silence. "But I hit back with a revenge you never expected. Not with fists, not with screams, but with the truth. And the truth, unlike your lies, cannot be buried." The officer moved to place cuffs on his wrists. The sound of metal clicking shut was more satisfying than any slap could ever be. For years, those hands had bruised me, broken me, silenced me. Now they were bound, powerless, reduced to begging. "Please," he said, his voice cracking, desperate. "We can fix this. You can't do this to me. I'm your husband." I leaned closer, looking into his eyes one last time, and whispered, "You were my husband, but you killed at the day you raised your hand against me. Now, you will live with the weight of what you've done. Alone." The officer led him away, his protests echoing into the night like the cries of a fallen king who had lost his throne. The neighbors watched from behind curtains as a man who once strutted with pride was escorted out like a criminal. And then the house was silent again. Silent, but no longer suffocating. For the first time, the silence was mine. Days passed, and the world whispered about the scandal. His empire crumbled overnight. The firm dropped him, the bank seized his assets, and his name became a cautionary tale. The mistress vanished into shadows, refusing to be associated with his disgrace. And me, the woman he thought would break forever, I rose from the ashes of his cruelty like fire, like dawn after a long and merciless night. I rebuilt my life on the ruins he left behind. With my brother's support and the inheritance I rightfully claimed, I turned the house that had once been a prison into a sanctuary for others. Women who had suffered in silence, just as I once had, found shelter within those walls. The laughter of children replaced the echo of slammed doors. Hope bloomed where despair had once taken root. And still, sometimes, I remembered his eyes in that final moment, the disbelief that I had not only survived but triumphed. He had thought revenge meant violence, but my revenge was life itself. I thrived where he expected me to wither. I built where he tried to destroy. I lived freely while he wasted away in a cell, haunted by memories of power slipping through his hands. Months later, I visited the prison, not out of pity, but closure. He sat across from me, his body thinner, his spirit dim. The arrogance was gone, replaced by hollow regret. "Why?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Why didn't you just leave me?" I looked at him for a long moment, then spoke the truth he could never have understood in his prime. Because leaving would have made you believe you won. But staying, fighting, and defeating you with the very truth you despise, that's what justice looks like. His eyes filled with tears, not for me, but for himself. I left without looking back. That chapter of my life was closed, sealed with fire and strength. The years that followed were mine. I built businesses, funded scholarships, created opportunities for women and children who had been silenced by fear. My name became a symbol of resilience, whispered in villages and cities alike. Not as a victim, not as a wife, but as a woman who rose from the fist of cruelty into the arms of destiny. And sometimes, late at night, I would sit by the window and watch the stars scatter across the sky. I would touch the scar on my cheek where his hand once landed, not with sorrow, but with pride. It was no longer a wound. It was a mark of survival, a reminder that pain could be the seed of power. He hit me hard in the face because of her. But I hit back with revenge that changed everything. And in the end, it wasn't just about him or her. It was about me, about every woman who has ever been told to stay silent. Every soul crushed under the weight of betrayal. My story became their story. My voice became their voice. And my revenge became their freedom. The world had expected me to fall, to disappear into shadows. Instead, I lit a fire so bright that even those who doubted me had to stop and stare. A fire that burned away the chains of fear and illuminated a path for others to follow. That was the ending he never expected. That was a revenge no fist could ever erase. And that was the beginning of everything.